Hi, everyone. This is Mr. P here. I think you can see me in the upper right-hand corner, coming to you with Lesson 8, the ways in which the United States used fear of communism during the Cold War era in the 50s in particular, to target Black and queer communities. So this will be a brief lesson on that, although the first part of it, the first 5 or 6 minutes, will give you background on the Cold War so that you can have a better context and understanding of the ways in which the US government and state governments here at home targeted specific communities during this period of time. So first, if you have no real context or understanding of the Cold War, I definitely listen to the first 5 minutes and then listen to the last, 8 minutes-ish, which looks at this particular question here. So let's jump to the background section here. So here we go. The study of the Cold War needs to begin with Karl Marx. And I'm not going to do a deep dive here. I'm just going to highlight some big ideas. And if you're in my IB class, you'll get a deeper dive in some Socratic seminars we do on Karl Marx. However, it's important to start here with him. And his ideology and philosophy is used by a lot of folks later in various communist-led revolutions. So Karl Marx has a critique of capitalism. And his critique of capitalism focuses on a variety of things. It's a structural critique. And I'm going to avoid going into the weeds on some of that. But I want to highlight two pieces. First, his critique of capitalism is based in the way in which it benefits the capitalist class and makes them quite wealthy at the harm of an exploitation of the working class. You might remember this simulation we did back in our study of imperialism when we were discussing the ways in which capitalism led to imperialism. And it's this industrial capitalism where the owners of the factories are making exorbitant wealth and only giving a tiny percentage of that wealth created by the labor of the working class. And Karl Marx critiques that exploitation, but he also critiques alienation caused by this structure, this capitalism. He critiques the ways in which we are alienated from ourselves, our communities, and our work. He wants work to be creative. He believes that the kind of work we do, what we produce, whether it's intellectual work, writing, or physical labor, or making, shoes, whatever it is, it should be creative and we should feel connected to it. We should experience joy in our work. That's kind of the thrust here. And he hopes that communism would create the society that, or that we would create the society, because we are agents in our own lives, that we would collectively create the society that would allow us to give what we can according to our ability and our creativity, and receive what we need in order to thrive and not just survive. And so you might think about your own schoolwork. What are the ways in which when do you feel joy with your schoolwork, and when do you feel like you're just doing it to do it for a teacher, and it feels alienating? It doesn't feel like it's something that really you connect with. There's a Marxist critique to be had of our school system currently in the ways that we often just have to produce for some other goal, and we don't always understand why we're doing it, and certainly don't always experience joy with it. So think about that. Then Trotsky and Lenin, to kind of fast forward to the early 1900s, Trotsky and Lenin in Russia take Marxist ideas and build a kind of Russian form vision of communism based in the peasant class, also the working class, and lead a revolution in the early 1900s at the end of World War I, where they take over the Tsar ruling family and create a new government in Russia. Alongside them is Stalin. Trotsky's kind of kicked out. Stalin begins to take power. Ultimately, Stalin ends up killing Trotsky in not firsthand, but he has someone kill him with an ice pick while he's in Mexico in exile. So all of these Russian communists didn't all agree for sure. And Stalin kind of takes Russian communism into the Soviet Union with a very strong authoritarian hand. This is important because a couple things. The West, US, Britain, France, end up intervening in that early revolution. Lots of distrust is sown. Despite that distrust, once they both face a common enemy, Nazi Germany, This is a map of Germany here after World War II. But once Nazi Germany and Hitler begin attacking both the British and the Russians, an alliance is formed between the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union, and they conquer. They defeat Germany together. And at the end of this war, World War II, the alliance begins to break down over disagreements about how to run Germany, how to implement a post-war Europe, and some of these these divides are over ideology. Difference between a vision of capitalism as an economic structure versus communism in the case of Soviet Union, state-run communism as an economic structure. The Soviet Union worries about security on their border. They were just invaded. They want states that are communist on their border in Eastern Europe so that they feel protected, a sort of buffer zone. This ultimately leads to, by 1949, the emergence of what becomes known as the Cold War, a war that's known as the Cold War because the US and Soviets do not fight directly, although they fight in a variety of wars. And the majority of people who die in the Cold War are Black and brown people in Asia and Africa. It is these proxy wars because of the fear of communism spreading that the U.S. wants to defend or protect against the spread of communism in places like the Congo or Vietnam or Korea. It's the desire for raw resources and raw materials also that leads to some of this fighting in Africa and Asia and also Latin America. Nevertheless, this fear of this domino effect, fear of communism that leads the U.S. to get involved in all these wars, that leads the Soviets to kind of also get involved in all these wars too, affects people at home. And you end up with a man named Senator McCarthy, leading to the Second Red Scare, where he begins targeting the American Communist Party and anyone suspected of communism in the United States. And so if you speak out against the U.S., you might be a communist. I remember my U.S. history teacher always used to joke about checking for commies under the bed before you went to bed, right? So during the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, there was a widespread fear of communism, and it was used as a scapegoat, or Black and queer communities were used kind of as a scapegoat during the Cold War. So you can read more about McCarthyism here. But I want to transition now to talking about Paul Robeson, who is one of the Black leaders targeted by the U.S. federal government on charges of communism. And he speaks out, for Black rights and is targeted. So before we get into that, Paul Robeson, featured here at his hearing at the Senate, is an incredible leader in the United States, political kind of leader in the sense that he speaks out for Black rights, but he's also a lawyer. He got his law degree from Columbia. He was an actor and famously known for being the first Black male lead in a Shakespeare play, Othello. He is quite an important person who ends up in Philadelphia at the end of his life. I believe it was his sister who owned the house at 50th and Walnut, and it's now a museum called the Paul Robeson House, and you can check it out and visit there. So Robeson, and I'm going to escape, pull the screen out for a second because I have quotes here in the lecture notes section. You can see me again in the lecture notes section. He gives a speech in 1949, right at the height of the beginning of the Cold War, where Robeson says, "We in America do not forget that it is on the backs of the poor whites of Europe and on the backs of millions of Black people the wealth of America has been acquired. And we are resolved that it shall be distributed in an equitable manner among all of our children, and we don't want any hysterical stupidity about our participating in a war against anybody, no matter whom. We are determined to fight for peace. We do not wish to fight the Soviet Union." So he's, at a time when there was a risk of war with the Soviet Union, there was an arms race during the Cold War, where, both sides were building up their nuclear power. That was kind of starting to get going in the late 40s, early 50s. Robeson did not want the U.S. to spend money on war. He wanted equitable distribution of wealth for everyone to have economic freedom here at home. The Associated Press, the newspapers, released a quote, which he did not say, which said, they quoted him as saying, "It is unthinkable that American Negroes will go to war on behalf of those who have oppressed us for generations against the Soviet Union, which in one generation has lifted our people to a full human dignity." So Paul Robeson gets painted as a traitor who would not, go to war to defend the United States, for a Soviet, commie-loving, possible communist himself person, and they take away his passport. And he has to speak before the House of Un-Americans Activities Committee in 1956 after he sued to get his passport back. And I really highly recommend that you watch the YouTube video or read the transcript where he goes back and forth with the senators. Really powerful, sharp, witty. He definitely gets the better of them. And I have a quote here on the next slide, which you could read if you could pause and read, but I really recommend taking the YouTube video where you can actually hear his voice. It's a recording of the actual account. But I'll draw your attention to a part of this quote where he says, I stand, I'll start here, although it is important to note that his dad was enslaved. He says here, "I stand here, struggling for the rights of my people to be full citizens in this country. And they are not. They are not in Mississippi, and they are not in Montgomery, Alabama. They are not in Washington. They are nowhere. And that is why I'm here today. You want to shut up every Negro who has the courage to stand up and fight for rights?" I guess it's covered up. Sorry. To fight for rights of his people, for the rights of workers. And I have been on many a picket line for the steel workers too, replying to something said earlier by a senator. And that is why I'm here today. And so Robeson says, it's not that I'm part of some communist party that you're trying to peg me for. I've not done anything wrong. I've merely spoken out for the rights of Black communities. And as a result, he gets targeted. It's important to remember that taking away his passport because he would, speak out against the United States abroad, that's important for the U.S. self-image. The U.S. did not want to be seen as backwards or racist because they wanted to be seen as better than the Soviet Union. So this becomes important during the Cold War. So they had to stop him from, critiquing the racism in the United States. While targeting Black communities, they also targeted queer communities. And for a few reasons. So let's together. So you can check out this video about Florida government and how they targeted queer communities specifically. But during this time, queer people are targeted because there's a faulty argument that says the Soviet Union, and communists abroad can get the queer people in the United States to support them and spy for them because queer people want to stay in the closet. Okay, that's the argument, that queer people want to stay in the closet, and therefore they won't risk being outed. And so the Soviets can trap them. They can say, "We will out you if you don't spy for us." That's the argument. Completely wild and create, a wild argument here. And as a result, the U.S. government, the federal government, fires a bunch of people they suspect of being gay in the federal government. This video opens with a really powerful testimony of someone who, was ultimately chased out of his job. Lots of teachers are fired in lots of states. And you can see here in this newspaper, right, the blackmailing, how the Reds blackmail homosexuals into spying for them. That's what I had just talked about. Queer people fought back. They marched and picketed to fight back against losing their government jobs in the State Department and other positions and teaching jobs. Universities across various states began to purge students. The FBI actually used to try and put agents, plants in to get people to agree to get men especially to agree to have sex with them, and then once they did agree, then they would say, "Oh, well, now you're gay, you're going to be fired or kicked out of this school." So it was an environment in which people were really scared. People were really fearful, and this is known as the Lavender Scare. This way in which this period when the Cold War was used to really target queer people and kick them out of jobs, kick them out of teaching positions, kick them out of school, college specifically. And so hopefully now you have a better understanding of how kind of the Cold War really ends up harming and being used to harm Black and queer communities in particular. Stay tuned for lesson lesson 8. Sorry, yeah, 8, which is next. Lesson 8 is next on the civil rights movement. Ciao.